This is Sarah Guthrie, granddaughter of Woody Guthrie.
As I was walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway. I saw below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me. Let's sing it together. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. Oh, I've roamed and rambled, and I follow my footsteps through the sparkling sands of her diamond deserts, and all around me a voice was sounding. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land. This land is mine. To the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest.
This is special programming from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. She the People, a forum held in Houston, Texas, the third largest city, I believe, in the U.S. Women of color were there, and 8 political candidates. The forum was organized by Aimee Allison. Aimee Allison is from the Bay Area, from Antioch, California. She is a protege of Barbara Lee and has been in many different campaigns across the U.S. She was born in Ohio, the East Bay town of Antioch. I'm reading from her biography here. She was one of 6 kids in a biracial family, daughter of a pioneer African-American plant pathologist and a European mother, a nurse practitioner and civil rights activist. So it was in her blood. She enlisted in the U.S. Army at 17 and had a heartbreaking experience of providing medical care to veterans in Palo Alto. VA shaped her political views. By the 90s, Allison had become one of the first women of color to be honorably discharged as a conscientious objector. The decision cemented her beliefs in the critical importance of strong moral leadership and political courage. And she watched political giants like the Reverend Jesse Jackson, and to probably some extent Shirley Chisholm. Of course, Shirley Chisholm, she's 49 years old, so she would have been on the tip of Shirley Chisholm. And Barbara Jordan, the late Barbara Jordan, the firebred out of Houston's 5th Ward, I believe it was there. She was in the Congress, a leading voice during the Watergate era. She later became a professor at Texas Southern and the University of Texas in Austin, Texas. She lived in Austin, Texas. A really great person. In fact, let's see who, Mickey Leland went on to be in the 5th Ward there in Houston, and many others that had been in that 5th Ward in Houston, Texas. A pioneering ward, I should say. Allison is president of the Democracy in Color. Of course, she founded She the People. I was just looking at some of the things that she has participated over her political process. Forums and initiations on race and gender at the Democratic National Committee, and at various other types of activities. She has an internet radio program or podcast, It is on a soundstage. You can also SoundCloud. Excuse me. You can also find us on our Boston Red broadcast on a soundstage. It was a year of women of color. She said this was the 2018 election. Excuse me. This is Politico's power list. They call it. Politico ever being the political opportunist that one can be. Anyway, this is naming of 100 different people she got on the list of various people there, and they give a little bit about, I was just reading from. This year she went to Georgia to support Stacey Abrams. That's another very interesting story. Joe Lunch Pail, I used to call him Lunch Box, we'll turn it to Lunch Pail Biden, made rumblings in the media about selecting Stacey Abrams to be his vice president in his run for president if he were to win the Democratic nomination. Of course, Stacey backed out of that particular situation. But that was no doubt a triumph for Mrs. Olson there. Ms. Olson, I should say. Let me now get to, this is by Fortour. She the People is changing politics, is what their description of it said, and these were the presidential candidates there. Twitter King Booker, Julian Castro, he used to be a HUD secretary. Tuishi Gilbrand, she is a representative from Hawaii. Kamala Harris, senator from California. Senator Klobuchar of Minnesota. Representative Beto O'Rourke, El Paso, Texas. Bernie Sanders, our own Bernie Sanders, and also our own Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren, and the make note here, the women do not get enough press coverage from the monopoly press. In fact, many times they are pretty much shut out. If you look at all of the candidates, whether it be Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, Elizabeth Warren, they just simply don't get the coverage that some of these people get. Even a clown like the South Bend pencil neck, Pete Buttigieg, gets a lot of coverage, and this is how people get promoted in the polls by name recognition. We vote for ourselves, yes, but we vote for our families, our communities, and our nation. We carry this nation on our backs. Our vote matters, she said, as the crowd moved on there. And we recall her taking the stage. Remember, she began, "We are a powerful voting bloc." If I can get it out here, one of 5 voters in primary states are women of color, and we are 25% of the voters in key swing states. Those swing states being Texas, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and Arizona. She delivered a message early, and often 8 people who came here today can't win the nomination without us. The form was before Joe Lunchpail Biden had entered the contest, but he, from our vantage point, he would not have been well received at this forum. This forum was basically of grassroots women of color that came from NGOs, that came from communities across the nation, from Brooklyn, New York, to California, to South Carolina, and various other points, New Mexico, in between. Nina was there, the Bernie campaign, she was there. The picture, Nina Turner, former senator out of Ohio. So we had the people there. There was no doubt about that. It's probably helped, but it was not a DNC sanctioned event. Yeah, that's a kiss of death. And the organization raised funds and operated outside traditional party circles. It cast a wide net. In California, a third of the registrants are independents. We call them non-aligned in the Commonwealth. they break towards being a more progressive. Now, in some places, independents or non-aligned break more towards the middle, and in some other places, they are more conservative. Allison has said on the San Francisco Chronicle political podcast, It's All Politics. We are making a space where we can talk about the issues, opening up past what the traditional lines of what is considered the Democratic Party in politics. While much of the post-forum coverage is focused on who appeared to win the crowd, I found more compelling the story in simply watching the candidates attempt to field relatively simple questions. Why should women of color vote for you? And that was a question. Elizabeth Warren got it. Amy Klobuchar got it. Kamala Harris got it. Mr. Castro got it. Twitter King Booker came out as the environmental type. He was the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, and connected up the environmental struggle with the struggle of African Americans and Latinos in that particular city. He didn't mention his ties to Wall Street, but nonetheless he was there and was very vivid. Beto O'Rourke talked about the city of El Paso being a multi-ethnic, a multiracial, no doubt about that. It's right on the border with Mexico. It is a city, a bilingual city. Beto O'Rourke is bilingual. He was one of two on the stage. I'm not certain about Kamala Harris, but Beto O'Rourke does speak Espanol. Obviously, Mr. Castro would. And I believe Twitter King Booker also is fluent in Spanish, and don't want to go too far out on the limb there. And there was the old school candidate, Bernie Sanders, who's been around a very, very long time. He was with the Congress of Racial Equality. For those that go back there, he was literally dragged off by the Chicago police demonstrating for open housing. That was in the 60s when Bernie journeyed from his native Brooklyn to Chicago. And he participated in every movement. He was at the March on Washington in 1963. He supported Jesse Jackson's two campaigns. That was when he was mayor of Burlington, Vermont, before he went to the House of Representatives. So Bernie has had a very long career as a progressive. He was a pamphleteer, organizer in Vermont, and that was how he finally got into being the mayor of Burlington, the largest city in Vermont. So it was a long story of him and being a progressive and answering the questions. He basically went to his talking points in his campaign. And some of the women, these women, younger women for the most part, Aimee Allison is, I believe, 49. So it is a generational change, as Pencil Neck from South Bend would say. But it is it is a change for the better. You can have generational changes and then come out with Deloitte Touche consultants, bean counters, like the Pencil Neck, and the types of programs that the DNC ran during the Clinton administration. Or you can advocate for progressive programs that move people forward, like Elizabeth Warren and her various programs that she has sponsored and successful. She was the single creator of the Consumer Protection Agency. It's now not protecting as many people as it should protect under DJ Trump. She was a bankruptcy lawyer. She grew up in the very red state of Oklahoma. She understands living on the edge. When her father got sick, he could no longer support the family. Her mother was 50 years old, had never worked outside of the house, but was determined they would not lose the house. They lost their station wagon. Anyway, nonetheless, the mother got a job at Sears, answering phones, when Sears was still a very big thing. and the family survived on a minimum. Couldn't do it today. The brothers are older than her. Elizabeth Warren's in her late 60s, so the brothers would be in their 70s. They went off to war, etc. But that is a story of struggle, and someone that was a business attorney, we call it, bankruptcy attorney, taught bankruptcy law in Houston, etc. Went on to Harvard, and she was a Republican into the 90s. She changed. The Republican Party left her behind. I'm not certain why she's a Republican. She'd have to tell you that story. But nonetheless, now she is one of the leaders of the progressive movement. It was unfortunately that there couldn't be an accommodation between her and Bernie. That just happens sometimes. But she's still not getting the recognition that she deserves. She is one of the true progressive candidates in this race. And you have Beto O'Rourke, who is a progressive, ran in Texas, came within, I believe, 2.3 percentage points of defeating Ted Cruz in a very red state. Had not happened in Texas since Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson was able to win in a congressional race, but that was a long time ago. And Texas has pretty much been out of reach of the Democratic Party for over 20 years, and then on that 20 years they have been in the wilderness. The party in Texas has to completely reorganize, and that can go to Beto O'Rourke. He literally traveled the state of Texas, over 200 counties in Texas, and he visited every county. And all they could talk about was a DWI that he had, and driving, and said, well, he left the scene of an accident. You know, you bring the trivia up in the American body politics, which really doesn't matter. What does matter is the policies that he proposes and how he will attempt to get that done. Going around the country talking about Medicare for all, those sorts of things that Bernie Sanders pioneered all of these progressive issues. He talked about Medicare for all, single payer, the minimum at 15, before any candidate out there talked about it on the national scene. That doesn't mean other candidates were not talking about something. Yes, we talked about a single payer. Bernie talked about it. They had it in Vermont, and some governor messed it up. Willie Romney, who was the governor of the Commonwealth, had mass care, and it's still there. That was before Obamacare. But health care is a very important situation because, as Aimee Allison would say, she had been a medic, and providing health care is very essential that everyone is provided basic preventive health care. And then we go to education as a right, not as a privilege. Education in the U.S. Under Dewey, etc., the little red schoolhouse, was pioneered in this country. And there is a history of that. The history course goes back further than that. I was reading the other day in Costa Rica that they had public education in the 1800s. It was popularized here in the 1900s. But just as we have public education in the basic grades through high school and some trade schools, now moving on, and this is nothing new, to colleges. 2 years of college or 4 years of college is required for 2019 education. So we have to move forward on the education front, on the employment front, to make certain that people are getting a livable wage. And even at $15 an hour due to inflation, etc., we'll be interested in talking about this later on a Numbers Man. That is our macroeconomic program. But these are some of the things that candidates were talking about there, whether it be the environmental piece from a Twitter King Booker. And there is a fact that toxic dumps are in communities of color. The water in Flint, Michigan being poisoned deliberately just to save a few bucks, as Bernie would say. Those kinds of things should not be tolerated in a civilized society. And even Joe Biden comes in and talks about the moral core of America, and we'll look at his record, how he has been to that core, and how he will bend in this campaign. This will be a campaign at this point in time of issues, but the corporate media is trying to turn this campaign into a campaign of quote-unquote personalities, and trying to brand with the aid of people at in the Democratic Party as outlaws. DJ Trump's going to run on socialism. He extended that to the outlaw illegal sanctions in Venezuela, and reimposing sanctions on Cuba and Nicaragua. But that's going to be his talking points. But at the same time, Joe Biden is saying, well, he can deal with a few millionaires. That's his program. So what the DNC wants to try to do is sandwich Bernie, Elizabeth Warren, and Beto, the progressives, between DJ Trump's reactionary campaign and his campaign talking about democratic socialists out there. So in other words, they both are going to run on the anti-socialist campaigns to try to mainstream this election to match up with Trump's American First campaign. The Democrats want to run America second, but it's the same old scheme. In the Obama administration, we have the American exceptionalism is the same thing. It's just not America First. They want to go back to the 50s. American exceptionalism took them back to the 1800s. So all of these things have linkage, and that's one thing to remember. We did an edited version. It's a little over, I believe, an hour, which we'll go to now. Enough about this. You have what the basic candidates is. We're at the forum, what they basically had to say. Now you will hear from them. And if we go to the LA Times, and I'll finish this up. They also lament Aimee Allison here, and where she worked. She worked in Alabama, Georgia, and Texas. So she's had a lot of experience getting out women of color, and women of color, very large situation there. Deanna Brown, she is deputy director of the Texas Organizing Project. Beto talked about it also. Deanna Brown is also in the Bernie Sanders campaign. So those are some of the things here. Access to the ballot was a constant reference there by Beto O'Rourke and others. Senator Harris, Senator Warren. Booker pledged to address the effects of pollution. We've already talked about that, and he also promised to select a woman. I don't know if you call that pandering or not. But old Lunchbox Joe beat him to it. And also Ms. Olson faulted the Clinton campaign 2016 for not doing enough to energize that constituency, citing technical errors such as failing to mobilize African American voters around Detroit. They also didn't mobilize European working class voters in Wisconsin. A lot of tactical errors with the Clinton campaign, and all of this hoopla on so-called what the Russians did. It's not what the Russians did. It was what the Clinton campaign did, what the monopoly media did, what the Republican Party did in terms of voter suppression. They had Gateway Snyder in Michigan to suppress as many votes as he could. The Republican legislature in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, all of those states, particularly in Georgia and in North Carolina, they suppressed the hell out of the vote. And that's what you have to talk about. And they also cited in the LA Times article, Doug Jones, he was elected to the Senate on the backs of African American women. A guy brought that up to me and said, well, the new thing is African American women. African American women have been around since Harriet Tubman. That is nothing new. Rosa Parks, Secretary of the NAACP, Ian Montgomery, the backbone of the movement there. she was not, as they say, a shrinking violet. She was with Mr. Williams and his organization, which was not an organization that was turning the other cheek. So there's been that history of African American women. Doris Hota of the one of Cesar Chavez's colleagues. All these people of color, they're nothing new. They've been out there for a very long time. Michelle Tremello, she's executive director of the Texas Organizing Project. Anyway, on we go to the She the People Forum from Houston, Texas. Good day, and we'll see you on the Monday morning quarterback.
This is Aimee Allison. I'm the founder of She the People. She the People is a national network to elevate the voice and political power of we women of color. I founded She the People to uphold 4 fundamental values. First, to love our own and each other. To seek justice for all. To ensure that everyone belongs. And finally, to make sure that this American democracy lives up to its greatest promise. Flooding right here in Houston. From the lack of infrastructure protecting sea rise levels to increased proximity in our communities to polluting facilities and busy roads, people of color are more likely to get asthma, pollution-related diseases, etc. As president, how will you address both pollution and poverty?
Thank you very much. I appreciate the question. It's very good to be here before this incredible audience of powerful Americans who will determine who the next nominee is from our party and who the next president is in the United States of America. I have come from a black and brown community. I've spent more years as a mayor of Newark, New Jersey than I have in the United States Senate. And when it comes to environmental issues, climate change, we have 12 years. But the reality is if you live in a community like mine, the environmental urgencies, the life or death issues are happening right now. And so whether it's toxic water, where we have a nation where millions of our children find it easier to find unleaded gasoline than unleaded water, whether it's asthma rates in communities like mine that are multiple times higher than suburbs and wealthy communities, or even if it's just knowing that in communities like ours, even planting in your soil, the EPA prevented us from doing. And so we have an urgency right now to deal with these issues. It's not something that I focused on just as a presidential candidate. We've been fighting these battles for environmental justice since I was a mayor. And there is common pain because whether it's the low-lying areas of North Carolina where these massive corporate CAFOs and pig farms are polluting areas, or the mountains of Alabama where you have Uniontown and Tallahassee where they have toxic dumps placed there, all of these things demand urgency. As United States Senator, I led the bill for environmental justice, bringing together activists from all around the country to put in teeth so that environmental activists have the power to change their communities, to control their own destiny. And as President of the United States, I will make sure that we do what's necessary for environmental justice, access to clean air, to clean water, and to deal with the urgencies of climate change by making sure we rejoin the Paris Climate Accords, re-up our commitments to clean energy standards, and make sure that we are dealing aggressively with a bold green future. And finally, let me just say that with climate change, we have 10 years to deal with it, but vulnerable communities are going to feel the impacts first. And so this cannot be something where we don't act with a sense of urgency. And we've got to be creative in the way we're going about it, both here by making sure we're investing in green technologies, giving those kind of tax breaks we've given to oil companies and coal companies now to green companies and renewable energy companies. And we have to lead in the globe because we just produce 14% of the problem. Unless we're starting to get involved in developing nations and give them the assistance and support to make sure that they are dealing with climate change too, we will not be successful.
Just a quick follow-up to you, Senator. We know that climate change also drives migration. You talked about reaching out and helping not just struggling communities in the United States, but struggling communities outside the United States where migration might be driven because of changes in the climate. We just saw the current president use a national emergency, declare a national emergency on the issue of immigration and the southern border. Would you, as president, use national emergency powers regarding climate change? Is it that serious of a threat that you would use national emergency powers?
So national emergency is a legal issue as well as sort of triggering certain actions. I'm talking about it is a national emergency now, that we have to act with that sense of urgency. And if you look at the United States military reports, they are showing exactly what you're saying. The climate crisis is going to cause refugee crises, famines. It's going to cause instability on the planet Earth like nothing we have seen before within the next decade to 2 decades. So we need to make sure that we are dealing with it with that same sense of urgency and start to use the levers that we have from our aid to make sure we're empowering people to move from coal to renewable energies and to making sure that we're dealing with stability in countries, doing the kind of things that don't destabilize nations, but empower nations to have self-determination and deal with their own issues.
So through the normal process, not through a national emergency?
Again, through the normal process.
Process. I think we have some wonderful audience members that are going to ask some questions. So let's have Mabry come up. There we are. Hello, Mabry.
How you doing?
Good. I'm not sure. Oh.
Hi,
where am I looking?
Senator Booker. I'm right here.
Okay. Oh, right here.
Yeah.
And you're
Mabry.
Awesome.
What question do you have?
So my name is Maria Teresa Mabry. I'm with Mi Gente, and I'm also a fellow with the Electoral Justice Project with the Movement for Black Lives. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, in your view, is taxing the wealthy and corporations a racial justice issue? And if so, what is your commitment to fighting for both racial justice and economic justice?
Thank you very much. So, absolutely. The way what we've been doing right now is taking our national treasure on this theory that somehow it's going to help all the people by giving trillions of dollars of tax breaks to the wealthiest in our country and the wealthiest in corporations, who ultimately, if you've seen recently, the recent tax record, some of our biggest corporations are paying effectively zero in taxes. This is absolutely a racial justice issue and an economic justice issue where you have Americans now looking at a nation where corporate profits are at an 85-year high and wages are at a 60-year low. I live, the only person in the United States Senate, I live in a black and brown inner city community that economically is below the poverty line. And I watch my neighbors who work full-time jobs catch extra shifts where they can, and when they go to my local bodega, they still have to use food stamps to meet the minimum basic needs of a family. That is unacceptable, that is injustice, and because it disproportionately affects African American, Latinos, and minorities, it is a racial injustice issue as well. And so we have to fix that by making our tax code reflect our values. And that's why no more bank shots, this idea that if we send it up, somehow it's going to come down. We're going to now make sure, if I'm president, that we have a tax code directly focused on working people. That's why I've supported the RISE Act, which takes the earned income tax credit and blows it up to almost twice the size. My RISE credit would get families about $8,000 back. It would lift 150 million working American salaries. It would take about poverty rates and cut them by a third in our nation. And even more than that, it would change the definition of work. Because there are so many people who have to stay home and take care of a spouse with dementia or a special needs child. That is work too, and they should qualify for a credit.
Yeah.
All right?
Thank you so much.
Thank you
for asking the question. We have Thank you so much for joining us.
So great to be here. Thank you for doing this. How are you, Joy? Good to see you.
Thanks for coming all the way from Hawaii.
Aloha. How you guys doing? I could hear you all the way in the back. Sounds great.
This is not your average presidential forum, I'll tell you right now.
I'm loving it.
We're breaking the mold.
That's right.
Let's begin with this. As a veteran, what will you do to restore full service rights for transgender members of the military? And as a follow-up, what is your plan to ensure the full civil rights of transgender Americans?
You know, this is something that hits me close to home. I'm a soldier in the Hawaii Army National Guard. There you go. I've served for a little over 16 years and deployed twice to the Middle East. My first deployment was to Iraq in 2005, second in 2008, and serving downrange, serving in a war zone, serving with Americans from all across this country, including LGBTQ Americans. It is something that there's a bond. There's a bond where I knew that if it came down to it, they would give their life for me. I would give my life for them. Special, amazing, selfless people who said, I will lay my life down for this country. That's a special and rare thing, and we as a country need to honor that service. We need to end the trans ban and make sure that we are actually living up to that ideal and those freedoms that so many service members have sacrificed so much for over generations. Freedoms for every single American, which unfortunately for the LGBTQ community is still not realized today.
You know, and I have a question also touching on your service in the military and, of course, your service in Congress. A lot of it has been around foreign policy issues. You've really been upfront on those kinds of issues. A lot of us have just been reading through the Mueller report. It's quite lengthy. But one of the things that it touched on was the ways in which Russia specifically targeted communities of color, impersonating Black Lives Matter, going after women of color, black women, and using that to divide the electorate and to discourage African American voters. And the second piece being literally targeting some of the voter rolls, going after voting systems in multiple states. Yeah. Do you believe that Russia is a threat to the voting rights of people of color?
I think Russia, what was done, as well as any other country that seeks to interfere in our democracy and in our elections, is unacceptable, and it has to be taken seriously for the threat that it provides. I think it's important, that second point that you made about actually trying to interfere in the voter rolls, in our elections systems. This is the huge vulnerability that threatens our next election that so far, unfortunately, has not been addressed. The fact that there are still many states in this country who don't have paper ballots or any kind of auditable paper trail to make sure that whether it's another country or an individual rogue actor comes in and tries to manipulate our votes, tries to change our votes to change the outcome of this election, our system is vulnerable to those hacks and attacks today. So I've introduced legislation in Congress called the Securing America's Elections Act. Very simply put, solves this problem by making sure that every single state either uses paper ballots or has a voter-verified paper backup, so that we in this country have an auditable paper trail to protect our democracy.
And do you think the current administration is doing enough to combat that kind of interference in 2020?
No, and I'll take it a step further. This administration is not doing enough. The Department of Homeland Security, that has jurisdiction over our election security, is not doing nearly enough. And Congress is not doing enough. I introduced this legislation in 2017. It has not been taken up in committee or on the House floor, nor has there been any other meaningful reforms that would accomplish this same objective. It is essential for us as voters to have faith that when we cast that vote, our voices will be heard. That's what my bill does, and that's what Congress needs to pass.
Thank you.
Yeah. I wanted to thank you very much for that. Let's have our first audience question. Welcome.
Hi, Congresswoman Gabbard.
Aloha.
My question for you, my name is Mara Zakaria, and my question for you is, what will you do to repeal the Muslim ban?
Thank you. Thank you for your question and for being here. Ever since President Trump put this ban in place, I have stood in strong opposition to it. And as president, I would lift that ban that is hurting and harming so many people and so many families, both here and in other countries around the world. I hear from both constituents of mine in Hawaii and friends in other parts of the country about their family members, their parents, siblings, uncles and aunts who previously would travel to and from the United States, whether it be from countries like Iran or other countries, and now are completely unable to do so. So this is something that's very important that has to be addressed, and I would do so as president. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much.
I want to follow up and say, in this era where Islamophobia is coming from the White House, what would you do to secure the civil rights of Muslim Americans?
This is such a dangerous time. You know, we just saw the attacks against Christians in their place of worship on Easter Sunday in Sri Lanka. We saw the terrorist attack against Muslims in their place of worship in Christchurch, terrorist attack against people who are worshiping in their synagogue in Pittsburgh. This is a time where we as a country, starting at the top, as president, but where all of us must stand up and condemn this hatred and bigotry and violence, whether it be based on religious reasons or the color of your skin or your ethnicity or where you come from. We have to speak with one voice to condemn this bigotry, to make it so that it is not okay, whether it be a slur or worse yet, an act of violence. This is not who we are in this country, and that leadership starts at the top. That leadership is what I would bring, coming from a place like Hawaii, where we are the most ethnically diverse state in the nation. We are diverse in many different ways. And what is so special is the aloha spirit, something that we call the aloha spirit, which basically means having respect and love and care for one another as children of God, bridging that divide that exists between us, recognizing each other, respecting each other. We'll have our differences. We can disagree without being disagreeable, but it is that recognition and that care for each other that we need at the forefront of this country so badly.
And I believe, do we have one more question? I think we do. Come on out.
Hi.
Aloha.
And I will tell you, as President of the United States, one of the things that I will implement is that we have mental health care on demand, and we have drug treatment on demand, because right now, even for those folks who are short of a crisis, let's say a suicidal episode, and then they can go to an emergency room, short of that, folks need to wait in line 3 to 6 months to get treatment. And so what ends up happening, during that period of time, they are still feeling the effects of their addiction and are exposed then to the possibility of being incarcerated. So all of these issues are connected. But one of the big failures of the government of the United States has been the failure to address mental health and the need for significant mental health treatments. And the other is to address the years of trauma that have existed because of exposure to violence and the trauma that poverty produces that has been undiagnosed and untreated. And I would absolutely put in place a priority around that, including putting resources through the federal government that can go into the states to address these issues. And I've done this work. Back when I was in San Francisco years ago, I worked with a woman by the name of Nadine Burke, who I counsel everyone to get her book, The Deepest Well, where she talks about what we know to be true, which is that in communities of color in particular, and this disproportionately impacts women of color who are raising families, we have children who have been exposed to trauma, and it could be a relative has been shot or killed, if the child has been in the foster care system, if a child is growing up with an incarcerated parent, and all of the trauma that might result from that, and how that can also manifest itself in terms of health outcomes, in terms of what we see in objective factors around exposure to trauma and health outcomes. These things are all related. And so when we expect that child to go to school the next day and learn without putting serious effort into helping that child deal with their trauma, it is destined to failure, which is what we are seeing.
I have a couple quick follow-ups for you, Senator. One,
thank you.
Would you broadly use your pardon power as president to release federal prisoners who are in prison merely for drug possession and drug-related crimes? Would you use that on a broader basis than you saw President Obama and previous presidents use?
Well, we certainly have seen this president do nothing about it except try to pardon his friends. So let's start there. But yeah, absolutely. And we have to have the courage to recognize that there are a lot of folks who have been incarcerated who should not have been incarcerated and are still in prison in large part because, to your point, Joy, they were convicted under draconian laws. They were convicted under draconian laws that have incarcerated them for, in some cases, a lifetime based on what is essentially a public health issue. So yes, I would.
I heard someone call out Colorado when you talked about legalization of marijuana. One of the things that's happening is in states like Colorado, where you do have some legalization, is you still have a stratified system where somebody who has a criminal record cannot get into the industry, they cannot get licensed to participate. And so you're seeing a gentrification of legalized marijuana. The industry is open to people with a lot of capital, with a lot of cash to spend, and who are then, in turn, also gentrifying neighborhoods. I grew up in Colorado. I can tell you the neighborhoods that used to be very tough neighborhoods are now very expensive.
No, I know. You're exactly right.
What could be done about that?
So first, what we've got to do is, like in my hometown of Oakland, California, what has happened is that there have been policies that have said that the young, invariably a lot of the people who historically were arrested for marijuana sales were young men of color. And so isn't that the irony of it all? That now this is one of the fastest growing money-making industries in our country. And the very young men who were trying to make money doing the same thing, but got criminalized and have now been branded felons for life, are excluded from the economic opportunities that are now available because of this new industry. So part of what has to happen is there have to be policies in place that look at the background and actually do the work of saying that some of those young men should be first in line to get the jobs that are available. And that their felony convictions should not be the barrier to them having employment in an industry that they were a part of before it was an industry.
Thank you for that.
Right? They were ahead of the curve.
Thank you. All right, we have a couple of questions from the audience. Let's have the first one. Welcome.
Hi,
how you doing? It's good to see you.
I'm Nikema Williams, and I have a little crew with me today.
Yes.
I serve as the Deputy Executive Director of Care and Action, but I'm also a state senator in the battleground state of Georgia.
Yes.
In November, while standing peacefully with my constituents in the Georgia state capitol, demanding that every vote be counted in the historic 2018 elections, I was arrested, along with 14 other Georgians, for making our voices heard. Counting every vote is the basic practice to a functioning democracy. How do you intend to protect Americans' votes and expand participation and access to democracy for everyone, no matter their party affiliation?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up. And thank you for your leadership, because Georgia is a battleground on so many issues, and not only about taking the country through the national election, but also we have seen rampant discrimination and abuse and, frankly, violations of the law as it relates to voting rights. And we saw the incredible work of Stacey Abrams there in terms of trying, so here's what I say about it. First of all, so elections matter. So forever, we would talk about in a presidential race the importance of the United States Supreme Court. And often in every election cycle, it is the most important, but often, unfortunately, the least persuasive reason for people to care about the outcome of the election is the United States Supreme Court. But we know that there are consequences for who will be president and what kind of court they will shape. So, on this subject, in 2013, the United States Supreme Court wrote Shelby v. Holder, which gutted the Voting Rights Act. And almost immediately thereafter, states put in place laws to discriminate and to create barriers for folks from voting. And it was targeted at people of color, it was targeted at students, it was targeted at Native Americans. And what we saw around this country, there were at least 22 states that almost immediately after that court decision put in discriminatory laws and laws that were designed to suppress folks' rights to vote. In fact, in North Carolina, the law was challenged to the point that the Court of Appeals, when reviewing the law that legislature passed, said that it was written with, quote, surgical precision to deny folks the right to vote. So it's a real issue, and it's a current issue. And so elections matter, both in terms of who is president of the United States and who is the Secretary of State of any given state and who is the governor of any given state. So let's, one, recognize the connection between elections and this issue. Two, let's recognize that until we can correct some of these laws, the way that we are going to get to the goal of ensuring that everyone exercise their right to vote is we are going to have to invest in community. We're going to have to invest in community leadership because we've right now got a lot of obstacles that until we get done with the legislation that is aimed at fixing the problems, until we get done with the litigation that is aimed at, holding people accountable that are suppressing the vote, until we get that done in the interim, we need to strengthen the community-based organizations that are focused on getting folks registered and helping them to the polls. But hold on, guys, there's one more piece of this. Having done work my entire life aligned with our civil rights community. Forever, this is not a new issue, voter suppression, not a new issue at all. Forever we have talked about the way to approach it, about litigation, legislation, and then obviously mobilization and community organization. There's a whole new 21st century version of this that we need to really be clear about. And that is manipulation by foreign governments in our election. Now, be clear. No, wait, but see, so here's the thing. The intelligence community came out with a report of what happened in 2016. Now, let's speak truth, because some people aren't clear about this. Not any of us. We're clear. Russia interfered in the election of the President of the United States. Okay. So the intelligence community has done a report on what happened. Included in that analysis is that an adversarial country who was attempting to destabilize our democracy decided that they would try and interfere with our elections and make the American public insecure and suspicious. And so they decided to target our vulnerabilities. And they exposed America's Achilles heel. The issue that they kept bringing up because they knew it would cause heat and dissension among us? Race. So guess what? The irony of it all is that what otherwise we have been always knowing as a civil rights issue has now become a national security issue. And we need to deal with it, and we need to deal with it knowing what they did in 2016. Because it didn't result in any real consequence, they will do again in 2020, and it will be about misinformation that is being done with a targeted effort to create dissension, which will lead to suppression because people will just get turned off, and they'll decide, you know what, I don't like any of these people, I'm just not going to vote. So we're going to have to really be vigilant in calling out the untruths when we see them, because I think this is where the power of the people is going to be critical to counteracting what will invariably be efforts to manipulate this election for President of the United States.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. One more. Quickly.
Hi. Hello, Senator Harris. My name is Lucy, and I'm with United We Dream Action. Okay. I'm 18 years old, and I will vote for the first time in the 2020 elections.
That's fantastic.
I have family members who are undocumented and live in danger every day.
Yeah.
As president, what will you do to stop deportation agents from tearing more families apart?
Right. So, first of all, we need a president of these United States who understands that we are a nation of immigrants, and instead of vilifying folks because he's trying to scapegoat folks to distract from the fact that he ain't done nothing, we need to have a president of the United States who understands that if we are going to be true to the values of who
from harm and criminalization at the hands of police.
Thank you for that question, and I'm sure many of you know that sad and horrific tale of Philando Castile, who was literally shot just driving and stopped for really not a good reason and was killed by a police officer. I supported the prosecution of that police officer, and he was prosecuted Unfortunately, the jury did not come back with a guilty verdict. But what we learned as a community in that case was you had this young man who worked in a cafeteria at his school, and he was loved by the students. They all adored him, and we lost him. I have met with his family, and it just reminds you of what we are dealing with right now in the criminal justice system. I have a law enforcement background, so I'm able to see it, and I've seen the racism that's in our system, and I've also seen the good work that we can do together. So I would say, first of all, our police departments and our prosecutors' offices have to reflect the community that we serve, and so do our grand juries. That's the first thing. The second thing is we have to train and put the money into training our officers. We have to pursue those cases when they violate the law. We have to take responsibility for those cases when they happen. And we also have to have a system that works. One of the things that I've been focused on since getting to the United States Senate is on our nonviolent drug offenses that have gotten ridiculously long on the federal level. I wrote a piece recently about a woman named Josephine that served 24 years for a nonviolent drug offense. She wasn't even doing drugs. She wasn't even selling drugs. And President Obama finally pardoned her. And in her words, she can now go back to being a grandma. True story. What do we need to do? We did one thing. The First Step Act that Cory and Kamala and I all co-sponsored, and that allows finally a reduction in those federal drug sentences. The second thing that we need to do is the Second Step Act, because 90% of people incarcerated in this country are not in federal prisons. They are in state and local jails. And so that step will mean putting out the incentives so the states do the right thing. And the last thing I would say is reentry. With the exception of violent offenders, murderers, heinous murderers, most people are going to be getting out of prison. And I was long involved in a program where you visited someone in prison. I visited her for years in prison, and she is now out. And that's what's going to happen to a lot of people. And we got to make sure that they're able to get jobs. The administration just did a really bad thing in that regard when it comes to diversion programs today that I oppose. We've got to make sure that people are able to vote when they get out of prison. We have to make sure that they're able to participate in our community. And those are all things in addition to how our criminal justice system acts. Equally importantly is how we allow people, when they get back into our society, to contribute.
And you talked about, as a quick follow-up, having a law enforcement background and a background as a prosecutor. One of the reasons it's so rare for police officers to be convicted in cases like Philando Castile's and others, no matter what the circumstances, police officers get the automatic presumption, essentially a presumption that they are in the right, so long as they can assert that they feared for their life. And it's really on the officer's word most of the time. At least that's the perception of most of the public. Do you support laws that give officers so much of a presumption of being in the right in shootings of unarmed civilians? Or should the laws be changed either to change that presumption to make there be more investigation, or to take the decision on prosecution out of the hands of prosecutors who are often working hand in hand with the police?
Okay, so a few things on that. Obviously, we should look at those laws. They're state by state, and I think they vary. But the things that I think are a problem, when I was a prosecutor, everything went to the grand jury. That's how we did it back then when there was a shooting. And I think there needs some more accountability with the individual county attorney, in my case, prosecutor, looking at those cases themselves and owning what happens. I think the investigation should not be done by the police department where the officer worked. I feel very strongly, and I actually took a stand on this way back when I had that job before, that shouldn't happen. So I think you have to have a fair process when you investigate these cases.
We have a couple questions from our audience members. Welcome to the stage.
Hello. That is very cool.
Thank you.
You guys you can't see the orange hair on your side, but it's very, very cool. There we go.
Hi, Senator Klobuchar.
Hello. getting rid of the situation where Warren Buffett actually pays less in taxes than his own secretary. Like, that's wrong. That brings in $125 billion right there. All right. The other thing that I would do is that I would make it easier to get these tax credits for families so that that's easier for them to afford college. I would make two-year community college free, right? Because right now, there are many people that are just going off the grid and they're not even graduating from high school. And the way you get them in jobs is by exposing them to apprenticeships and making it easy to get those community college degrees, both while they're in high school and where they're out of high school. And the final thing I would do, as we're here in Texas, is comprehensive immigration reform. Because if we don't have that, if we don't make it easier for all kids to pursue the American dream, and I know there's dreamers out there who, by the way, have every right to be in this country and have every right to participate in the education in this country, that want to serve in the military. And with comprehensive immigration reform, it would make it a lot easier for millions of people to pursue an education and fill the jobs that we have open in America today. So I see it as a moral imperative, but I also see it as an economic imperative. And one time I found a 99-year-old Hispanic veteran. I was trying to make the case at home. And this was a guy that was brought over from Mexico. He lived in Sleepy Eye, Minnesota. He didn't know that he had been brought over as a kid. He thought he was born in our country. He signed up to fight in World War II. That's when he found out. And back then he told me, you know how you became an American citizen? He said, they brought me to Canada, the Army did, for one night, and I stayed in a hotel, and I came back and I was a citizen. That's what they used to do. He served under General MacArthur. He came back. He met his wife. They had a child. That kid served in the Vietnam War, and I brought that veteran to stand at the World War II memorial with two dreamers from the suburbs who wanted to serve in the Air Force. And they couldn't because of our laws now. That's wrong, and we need to change it. So if you look at education, you look at making it affordable for everyone, but you specifically look at how we're handling the immigrant community. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're asking each of the candidates to make the case of why women of color should choose them. You are a Midwestern candidate. Part of the tug of war in the Democratic Party is whether to try to go for the Midwest and try to convert Trump voters, or try to go for the base and really bring out particularly African-American women who are such reliable voters. If your base is really Midwestern voters, if your sort of a great selling point is that you can bring over white working class voters, then why should women of color believe that you are their champion?
Okay, good. Here we go. First of all, we have to do both to win, all right? And we have to do both. You look at what happened in this last election. You think of the anniversary, Shirley Chisholm, the first woman, African-American woman in Congress. Guess what? 50 years later to the day, for the first time, we elected 20 African-American women to Congress. That is the arc of justice, and we need more. Certainly in the last election, when you look at how close we were in states, if Stacey Abrams, the great Stacey Abrams, by the way, if she had had a fair shot with the election, she would have won that governorship of Georgia, and we saw change across the country. So how would I lead this ticket, and why am I the one to do it? First of all, I can't pretend to be in your shoes. I'm in one of your shoes as the first woman in many of the jobs I've had, and I know what it's like to be in that room when people aren't taking you seriously. But I can't imagine what it would be like to be the woman who was in the maternity room in that hospital in New Orleans that's telling her doctor that her fingers are swelling and he's not listening and she loses her baby. Or what it's like to be a vice president as a company, someone I know who goes shopping and then gets followed by store security. That happened. I can't imagine what it is like to make, so African-American woman to make 61 cents an hour compared to what a man makes, right? A white man. That's wrong. But what I can tell you is that my entire life I have fought for justice. I fought for justice in the Senate. I've been a lead on many of those bills involving voting. Sherrod Brown and I are leading the bill to stop the voting purges, because if you want a seat at the table, you can't be on the menu, and you've got to be able to vote in this democracy. So that's my first thing. The second thing is looking at our economy, where African American women have not been treated fairly. And if we want an economy that works for everyone, we have to make these leaders in these companies understand that they've got high-paying job open in the technology field. The answer is in this room, right? Those are the people that should be applying for their jobs. And the first, one of the first bills that this president, who I believe has turned his back on African American women, that this president signed into law was a bill I led that allowed more women and created incentives for women of color to get into the STEM fields. Yeah. Did he invite me to the bill signing? No, he did not. But it was my bill. And so when we look...
And Senator,
and so
we're almost
the
out
end
of time.
is, and I will end with this, it was Barbara Jordan from this great state who once said that what Americans want is something quite simple. They want a country as good as its promise. Let's make good on this promise.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
You're a lot taller.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Please have a seat. We're here in Texas.
That's
yeah.
right.
You
Good to see everybody.
Yeah, you got some
We got to
fans.
play Homecoming again for the second time.
All right, welcome, and thank you for joining us here at She the People.
Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be in the home district of Sheila Jackson Lee, back at TSU. Thank you for hosting us, and with the two of you, thank you for the invitation to join you. We're glad to be here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're going to talk voting rights to kick things off. One of the most important outcomes of 2018 was in Florida, the passage of Amendment 4. Some of the amazing organizers behind that victory are in the audience today, and it paved the way to restore voting rights to formerly incarcerated people. So what would you do as president to build on these kind of victories, to expand the voting rights for people that have been caught up in the criminal justice system in every state?
Yeah. First of all, let's build on the great work that you have done in Florida. Let's pick up the message and the inspiration laid down by Stacey Abrams in Georgia and her response to the State of the Union, where she made this the central theme. Let's follow the lead of the Texas Organizing Project here in Houston, Texas, and Harris County, which ensured that no one is written off and helped to inform those who had been convicted in Texas of their voting rights and that they could register once again and participate in their democracy. And it is owing to them and the leadership that we especially saw here in this community that Texas, which had been 50th in the country in voter turnout, not because we love our democracy any less than anyone else, but because we were drawn that way by our state legislature. We have voter ID laws that say you can use your license to carry a firearm to prove who you are at the ballot box, but you cannot use your student ID from TSU to prove who you are at the ballot box. We've got to overcome the institutional racism in our democracy, especially in the states of the former Confederacy, with a new Voting Rights Act that I want to sign into law. Automatic voter registration for every 18-year-old coming of age. Same-day voter registration in this country. Ending gerrymandering, and we are at the epicenter of some of the worst of it here in Texas. And yes, making sure that those who have convictions, who have done time in a country whose criminal justice system is one of the most unjust in the world, where it is disproportionately comprised of people of color. Let us make sure that we restore their full rights, including their right to vote. Thank you for asking.
Congressman, we know that the Trump administration is right now attempting to add a citizenship question to the census, to the 2020 census, which most experts believe would depress responses to the census, could actually disenfranchise many Americans of color because it could reduce the number of representatives, and it could also just put fear into communities with lots of immigrants in them. Texas is one of those states that would be hard hit on all of those fronts. If the Supreme Court affirms and allows this administration to add that question to the census, then what can be done to ensure that people feel confident and comfortable answering the census, that you don't see a depression in responses that can hurt, particularly immigrant communities here in Texas?
Absolutely. So this is a question about who is counted and who counts in our communities and in our country. I can tell you from the perspective of El Paso, which forms the largest binational community with Ciudad Juarez in the Western Hemisphere, and also happens to be one of the safest cities in the United States, 20 years running. That safety is not despite the fact that we are a city of immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees. It is because we are a city of immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees. And when you listen to our local law enforcement leadership, including Sheriff Richard Wiles, he will tell you that when those in our community, including those in mixed immigration status households, trust law enforcement, they're more willing to report a crime, serve as a witness, testify in a trial, demonstrably make us safer because they feel free to participate. When people fear their government, law enforcement, participating, it will make us not more, it will make us less safe. And here we are in the most diverse city in the United States of America, bar none. It is hard to think, as you suggested, of a community or a state that will be hit harder by this misinformed and maybe malicious decision than Texas. It means that we lose out on funding for schools, for infrastructure, for quality of life and opportunity and an ability to fully participate in this economy. And it sows fear in our communities at a time that we need to bring everyone together and out of the shadows to build our country's greatness. As president, I would nominate a Secretary of Commerce who would make sure that everyone is counted, everyone is included. If this decision is upheld by the Supreme Court, it is one that we will challenge from our administration, make sure that is overturned and that everyone in this country is counted.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Everybody, you have questions?
Yeah.
Let's bring on our first questioner.
Hello, my name is Damaris. I'm a 17-year-old undocumented student. I'm here with United We Dream Action. I know that you're from a border city, and you have seen the horrible detention camps there and in other states. What is your plan to pass new citizenship laws and protect immigrants from deportation? My life and many of these beautiful people's lives are on the line. So how are you going to make sure that these immigrants are protected and not harmed?
Damaris, thank you. Thanks for being here and for the question and for your leadership. And it is a reminder to me, to all of us, that the great changes that we have seen in this country's history has so often been produced and purchased by the service and the sacrifice of young people like you. We were just in Greensboro, North Carolina, and we think about the Greensboro Four, who helped to integrate places of public accommodation, the Rock Hill Nine the Friendship Nine in Rock Hill, South Carolina, the Freedom Riders in the Deep South, the Dreamers today who are standing up not just for themselves, for their parents, the original Dreamers, and for immigrants across this country from every place on this planet, to make sure that they are permanently freed from any fear of deportation by making them U.S. citizens in this country. That would be the first order of business. Ensuring that their parents and millions more can come out of the shadows as well, contribute to their full potential, to their families, to their communities, and to this country's greatness and to our shared success. And you mentioned these detention camps that we saw in Tornillo, Texas. What I saw from you, from the people of Texas, is that with under 24 hours notice, more than 1,000 of you showed up in the Chihuahuan desert outside of Tornillo to bear witness, to testify, to make sure that our fellow Americans understood what was being done in our names, that we were taking children from their mothers and fathers after having completed a more than 2,000-mile journey, fleeing the deadliest places on the planet today, trying to follow our own asylum laws, and I would argue being illegally blocked and rejected and arrested and separated and caged by this president and this administration. Leadership like yours forced the administration, at least temporarily, to stop separating families. Now the onus is on us not only to pass comprehensive immigration reform that we just described, but to ensure that not another child is taken from another parent and that we reunite those families who've been separated so far. So thank you, Mayor, for being here.
May I ask you a quick follow-up? There are still some children that have not been returned to their parents. Should there be some sort of civic sanction for those who advocated a policy of separating mothers and fathers from their children and not returning them?
I think without accountability, you won't have justice. Without justice, you will not have rule of law in this country. And without accepting that no person, no matter what office he occupies, is above the law, then this country's not going to fulfill its promise or live according to its constitution. So yes, there have to be consequences for people who rejected asylum seekers who will lawfully trying to present themselves at our international ports of entry with not a penny to their name, fearing for their lives and the lives of their kids, attempted again to follow our laws by crossing in between ports of entry, arrested themselves. And this is the parlance of the Border Patrol agents. They tell us they don't flee detection and apprehension. They turn themselves in, seeking refuge and shelter from a country of refugees and asylum seekers, and to be met not with salvation, but your worst nightmare, that child torn from your arms by force, put into a cage, you deported back to the very country from which you fled. Yes, there has to be consequence for those kind of actions. And I want to make sure we hold everyone responsible, accountable.
You mean legal sanction, a civic sanction, lawsuits? What do you mean?
Absolutely. Where people broke the law. And my understanding, especially when it comes to our asylum laws, it is very clear. If you come here, petition for asylum, which affords you no guarantee that petition will be accepted, that you will be able to stay here, but that you at least be allowed to follow that process here on U.S. soil. That's the law, at least as I understand it. I want to make sure that it is followed, and those who defy it are held accountable.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think someone was asking, should ICE be disbanded?
I hear you on this. The practices under this president, the practices under the last president, where families were broken up, where you had internal enforcement. I think in 1 year alone in the previous administration, 400,000 deportations from inside the United States. Some people who had been here for decades, who posed no threat to their families, to their communities, to this country. In fact, in any way that you can measure, are contributing far more than they are ever taking. And I made the case earlier using El Paso as the example, are also contributing to our security and to our safety. We don't need those internal roundups and deportations and enforcement. We do need to make sure that anyone who threatens the lives of our fellow Americans or who has used violence, that there is accountability. Okay? But I want to make sure that we include everyone in the solution to our challenges, economic, security, safety, democratic, or otherwise. And having these ICE internal enforcement operations is not the way to do it. So appreciate the question.
Under an O'Rourke administration, will ICE exist? Yes or no?
Yes, it will, but it will not employ those practices that we've seen not just under this administration, but under the previous administration.
Okay,
Thanks for asking.
Thank you. Let's have our second question from the audience. Thank you. Welcome to the stage.
Hi, Congressman O'Rourke. My name is Sakiva Russell. I'm a member leader of Restaurant Opportunity Centers, and I'm a server in New Orleans where the minimum wage is just $2.13 an hour. Most of the 5 million tip workers and 13 million restaurant workers across the country who earn that ridiculous sub-minimum wage are women and people of color like me who have to deal with and suffer from sexual harassment just to get the tips and wages that we deserve. For example, I was working a night shift at my job, and I was turned down tip from a male customer who refused to give me a tip because I refused to give him my number. So there are currently 2 bills that have been introduced in Congress to get rid of the lower wage for tipped workers so that we get a full livable minimum wage like everyone else. So, Congressman O'Rourke, my questions to you are, what are your plans to ensure that all workers, including tip workers like me, get the full wages that we deserve so that we can feed our families without being harassed daily?
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, for offering your experience as an example for the urgency with which we must meet this challenge. So, yes, I support a $15 minimum hourly wage in this country for everyone without exception, regardless of your occupation. I want to make sure that you are protected from harassment and intimidation in your place of work. So I want to strengthen those protections and the accountability and justice for those who violate the protections that are in place. But I also want to acknowledge that a minimum wage is not going to be enough, especially when it comes to women of color. Women alone in this country are paid 80 cents on average what a man is paid for the same job. But African American women, 61 cents of what a man is paid. Latinas, 53 cents of what a man is paid. We also need an equal rights amendment ratified in this country so that no woman can be discriminated against on any basis whatsoever. So those are the ways that I want to meet this challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And a follow-up for the ERA, since that's a big one. As a president, how would you champion an ERA for the 21st century?
You know, I would make sure that we have conversations just like the one that we had. It's not enough to be on the right side of this issue, to lay out a vision for where we need to get to. I think bringing everybody in, as we learn, traveling to the 254 counties of the state of Texas, no matter how red or blue, how big or small, nobody written off, everyone included in the conversation. And what we found time and again were so many inspiring examples of local leadership. I think of one in particular, a councilwoman in DeSoto, Texas, Candace Quarles, who just helped to pass paid family leave to correct some of the economic injustice and lack of access and opportunity. So let's make sure that Candace is helping to lead that conversation in DeSoto and Dallas County, and then do that across the country, especially in those states that will be critical in ratifying the ERA so that it becomes part of our Constitution. Yeah.
All right. Well, our exit question that we've been asking with so many people running, 20, we've been saying, and counting, we don't know, there could be 40 by next week. And with so much diversity among those who are running, women, people of color, why should women of color choose you?
So it's...
We'll wait.
Yeah.
We'll wait.
Take your time.
I will. Not something that I'm owed, not something that I expect, something that I fully hope to earn by the work that I do on the campaign trail, by showing up and listening to the people that I want to serve. Was just talking to Sheila Jackson Lee backstage. Extraordinary leader and mentor to me when I was a member of Congress. We talked about reparations and her House Bill 40 that is so important to the future of everyone in this country, to ensure that we know our history, our true story, so that we stop visiting injustices on future generations and begin the work of repair. I remember meeting with Council Member Amanda Edwards, again here in Houston, Texas, on access to Capitol for communities that have been excluded from Capitol from the very foundation of this country. Talking to Alyssa Simmons, who heads up the NAACP in Arlington, Texas. This state is at the epicenter of a maternal mortality crisis, 3 times as deadly for women of color. She explained to me that in a community like Arlington that does not have a mass transit system, even if you're covered, try getting to a clinic or a hospital. And then someone else interjected, even if you get to that clinic or hospital, there is disparate treatment for women of color in this country that also helps to explain a disparity in infant mortality that is greater now between white America and black America in 2019 than it was in 1850, 15 years before the abolition of slavery. So showing up, listening, incorporating what I hear, everyone's experiences into this campaign, into our service, is how I hope to earn the support and the vote of the people of this country. So,
and there you have it,
Congressman
Beto O'Rourke.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please have a seat. A warm welcome for the senator.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be with you.
We are so happy to have you. To kick things off with our time with you, 1 of 3 women have been victims of some form of physical violence by an intimate partner within their lifetime. That's all of us in this room and across the country. 1 in 5 women have been raped. And further, each year, thousands of women and girls, particularly black women and girls, indigenous and transgender, are kidnapped, trafficked, or murdered. What is your plan, and what would your plan be as president to end gender-based violence?
Well, for a start, we have got to recognize the severity of the program, of the problem, and make sure that this does not continue to exist. All right? And that means, by the way, not only specific plans and programs, it means a fundamental change in the culture of this country. All right? And that means that every woman in a job feels safe in the workplace, feels safe on campus, that anybody who rapes or harasses understand there will be a severe penalty to be paid for that.
We just had the candidate that came on before you talk about the Equal Rights Amendment. Do you believe that, I think it's about 2 states away from being ratified. Do you believe that, 1 state away from being ratified. Do you believe this country needs a constitutional amendment enshrining the rights of women?
I do. And I think, look, we have had, as a nation, as everybody knows, a troubled history in terms of racism, in terms of sexism, in terms of homophobia, and many other injustices. And I think it is absolutely appropriate to say in the Constitution of the United States that women will be equal to men, end of discussion.
And one quick follow-up, we have some questions to bring out. Can you name a policy of yours, what you would champion as president, that would specifically help women of color?
The answer is absolutely. I mean, and it's not just, Joy, not just one policy. It's a number of policies. It is to say that in the year 2019, the time is very long overdue to end institutional racism in all of its forms all over this country. And what does that mean? It means to say that we will not accept discrimination in the workforce. It means that we will end the absurdity of women in general making 80 cents on the dollar compared to men, and minority women making a whole lot less than that. It means we're going to open the doors of educational opportunity for all people, regardless of income. And one of the issues that I have been very proud of, and 4 years ago, as you will well know, these were not widely popular issues. But you talk about equal opportunity, I said then and I say now, that every person in this country, regardless of color, regardless of income, has the right to get a higher education, because we're going to make public colleges and universities tuition-free, and we are going to very substantially end the burden of outrageous levels of student debt in this country.
We all witnessed the Kavanaugh hearings and ultimately Kavanaugh having a place of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is stacked against women of color, I would say. Meanwhile, the Trump administration has been filling federal judgeships with right-wing, anti-woman of color people. What could you do as president to overcome those obstacles that are being put in place right now for after taking office in 2021?
Well, the first thing is that my pledge to you, and I don't make a whole lot of campaign promises, but that is, as President of the United States, I will appoint Supreme Court justices and nominate justices all across the board who will represent the needs of people of color, of working people, and who are prepared to believe and fight for justice, not just the people on top. So that's number one. Number two, I know there's been a lot of discussion about packing the court and so forth. I'm not for that, because I think the next party that comes to power will do the same thing. But I think what we can do is something fairly novel, is that after a member of the Supreme Court serves for a certain period of time, perhaps 12 years or so, that justice then rotates to an appeals court. That'll give you some fresh blood.
And we know that, this primary has a lot of people in it, but if you look at where you stand right now in the polls, you are in the first, second, or third in most of the polls. You're polling very well in every state. But in order to consolidate the nomination, you have to win over Hillary Clinton voters.
Yeah.
What are you doing to try to win over those voters, which includes a substantial share of the women of color, of the black women who voted in 2016?
All right, let me make good question, and let me answer it. Let me answer it in a couple of ways. First of all, obviously, we are working really hard to win the Democratic nomination, and if I do that, we're going to work really hard to defeat the most dangerous president in the modern history of this country. And to your point, the Democratic Party has got to be united. All right? I hope to win the nomination, and I hope to have my fellow candidates, people who are seeking the nomination, many of whom are personal friends, support me if I win. But my pledge to you is, if I do not win, I will do everything that I can to make sure that that Democratic candidate becomes the next president of the United States. This is no time for petty divisiveness. This is a time to stand together in the fight not only to defeat Trump and his racism and his sexism and his homophobia. This is a time for the American people to come together in the fight for economic justice, social justice, racial justice, and environmental justice. And that is what this campaign is about.
Yeah. And for black women specifically?
I'm sorry?
For black women specifically?
The black women will be an integral part of what our campaign and what our administration is about.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Okay? And that means...
Hold on.
Okay.
Hold on.
Yeah. Were you finished with your? Because
Yeah.
I want.
Yeah,
okay.
go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to bring on our audience question.
Yeah.
Please come to the stage.
Thank you for being here, Senator Sanders.
Thank you.
My name is Sayu Bojwani, and I'm the president of New American Leaders, which works to help immigrants ready to lead. And as a woman of color myself, I have dedicated 3 decades to ensuring that people like me feel like we belong and are full citizens of this country. Just last week, the son of a Louisiana sheriff was arrested for allegedly burning down 3 historically black churches in that state. Unfortunately, this is just one of a consistent string of terrorist attacks committed by white men to enact fear on people of color in the United States. What do you believe is the federal government's role to fight against the rise of white nationalism and white terrorist acts, and how do you plan to lead on that in your first year as president?
Okay.
Thank you.
First of all, but we have got to make it very clear that the type of demagoguery we are seeing from the Trump administration is not what this country is about. And I will do everything that I can to help lead this country in a direction that ends all forms of discrimination, racial discrimination, gender discrimination, and discrimination based on people's sexual orientation. I am the son of an immigrant, the proud son of an immigrant, and I will do everything that I can to make sure that we pass, finally in this country, comprehensive immigration reform and a path toward citizenship, that we provide immediate legal protection to the 1.8 million young people eligible for the DACA program. So the goal that we have got to establish is to bring our people together around an agenda that speaks to all people. And that means guaranteeing health care to every man, woman, and child as a right, not a privilege. And I'm proud to have led the effort to fight for a Medicare for all single-payer program. It means understanding that when we talk about minority communities, when we raise that federal minimum wage to a living wage of $15 an hour, you're going to do away with a lot of economic stress in this country. So those are some of the things that I think we've got to do.
Let me just follow up, Senator. The core of the question is about, as president, what would you do with the rise of white supremacist violence to protect our communities?
Absolutely. You know, as somebody who I know I date myself a little bit here, but I actually was at the March on Washington with Dr. King back in 1963. And as somebody who actively supported Jesse Jackson's campaign as one of the few white elected officials to do so in '88, I have dedicated my life to the fight against racism and sexism and discrimination of all forms. And as President of the United States, at the very top of our agenda will be the understanding that discrimination of all forms has got to end, period. And you do that using the bully pulpit, and you use that doing legislation. If somebody wants to go around perpetrating hate crimes, that person will pay a very, very heavy price indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think what the questioner is getting at is a phenomenon that is actually global. We're seeing it throughout Western Europe as well, as influxes of immigrants from the Middle East come in. You're seeing the same kinds of rises of white nationalism.
Well, let me just say a word on that. That's correct.
Yeah. So as president, what would you do to return the U.S. to global leadership on that issue?
Well, you reverse exactly what Trump is doing. Trump is a cowardly, authoritarian president who is he hides the reality that he has tried to throw 30+ million people off health care, give huge tax breaks to billionaires, cut Medicare, cut Medicaid, and education. You can't win an election doing that. So what do? You do what demagogues in Europe and in this country have always done. You scapegoat. You go after immigrants. You go after people of color. You go after minorities. You say those people are the problem. It's not Wall Street. It's not the drug companies. It's not the insurance companies. It is undocumented immigrants. That is demagoguery. You're right. It exists in this country. It exists all over the world. And as President of the United States, our foreign policy will not be, as the current one is, to support authoritarian bigots all over the country. It will be a policy of supporting democracy and human rights.
The women in this room represent 28 states, mostly South and Southwest. In many of these states, women of color, the majority of women, and we're the strongest Democratic vote in the South and Southwest, which is the reason for this forum. In your first 100 days, what would you do as president to indicate and support and center the leadership of women of color, particularly from the states represented in this room?
Well, the first thing I do, and here's my second campaign promise to you, is my administration will look like America. All right? It will be representatives of the people of America. It will be representatives from people who understand the pain and the struggle that working people and minorities are currently feeling. It will not be an administration of wealthy bankers and Wall Street executives, but it will be an administration reflecting all of our people who are prepared to stand up for economic, social, and racial justice.
The question that we've been asking each of our candidates who've come out today is that we know that there is a very diverse, very large field running for the Democratic nomination. It includes many diverse candidates, women, people of color. With all of those options on the table, why should women of color, black women, choose you?
I think what I would ask of people is a couple of things. Look at my record and look at what I have campaigned on. 4 years ago, it was not a popular idea to suggest that health care for all was a right, not a privilege. Today, that concept is seeping through all over this country. 4 years ago, it was not a popular idea to say that we have got to take on a broken, criminal, racist, criminal justice system and bring about real reform which ends the absurdity of the United States having more people in jail than any other country on earth. 4 years ago, I said that we have got to end the war on drugs and legalize marijuana. We have come a long way in 4 years. 4 years ago, when people were kind of laughing at me when they asked me what is the major national security crisis facing America, I said it was climate change, and that we have a moral imperative to transform our energy system. The bottom line is that many of the ideas that I brought forth 4 years ago are now widely accepted by the American people, and Democratic candidates from school board to President of the United States are now supporting them. And when we talk about justice, we are also talking about the massive levels of racial disparities that exist in this country. It's not just that we need health care for all people. We need to address the fact that infant mortality in the African American community is 2.5 times what it is in the white community. That white families have 10 times the wealth of black families. That in the criminal justice system, African Americans get arrested far more frequently than whites. So the campaign is about two things. It is suggesting very strongly that we cannot continue a nation when 3 families have more wealth than the bottom half of America, when you have a political system which is corrupt because billionaires are able to buy elections. And then within the midst of all of that income and wealth disparity at a national level, we have racial disparities as well. So our campaign is twofold: taking on the big money interests on Wall Street, the insurance companies, the military-industrial complex, the prison-industrial complex. And if you look at what the mantra of our campaign is, it is us, not me. Because I understand, and I believe this very strongly, that no president, not the best intentioned, not the most honest, can do it alone. If you want to transform America, you want health care for all, you want real criminal justice reform, you want to deal with climate change, you're going to have to take on together, we're going to have to take on incredibly powerful institutions that have unlimited sums of money. So my campaign is about not just winning the nomination, not just defeating Trump. It is the understanding that we cannot transform this country unless millions of people, black and white and Latino, Asian American, Native American, stand up and take on the very powerful, greedy special interests who dominate the economic and political life of this country.
Ladies, Senator Bernie Sanders, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Warren.
Great to see you. Thank you. Thank you.
I didn't get the green memo. I'm a little. I'm a
there
bit,
you go.
I'm a bit off color here.
Green is for God. Senator Warren, you've been busy. I have been. Okay. All right. I want to do something a little bit different. I want to ask the audience question to come out first. Let's start, because the women in this room are the real superstars of American politics and democracy.
They are.
Let's have one come out.
Come on. Woohoo!
Oh, your mic. Let's see.
Senator Warren.
Can we get that mic on? Or switch it out?
Two.
Oh,
Good afternoon, Senator Warren.
Good afternoon.
Okay, my name is Monifa, and I'm from Brooklyn, New York.
Hello, Monifa.
I'm a senior vice president at Moms Rising, working on maternal health.
Yes.
And I'm a proud member of the Movement for Black Lives.
Yep.
And my question is about maternal health. The United States is one of only 13 countries in the world where the rate of maternal mortality is now worse than it was 25 years ago.
Yes, ma'am.
For Black women, the risk of death from pregnancy-related causes is 3 to 4 times higher than for white women, and Black women are twice as likely to suffer from life-threatening pregnancy complications. What will you do to address this crisis that persists independent of education and income?
Oh, great question, Monifa, and I'm so glad you asked it because it is so important. Let me just start by saying, I think everything that happens in government is ultimately about our values. But boy, nowhere do you see it more than measure the values that a country has by how it treats its mamas and its babies. And the United States, for 25 years, has profoundly failed on this front. We have failed our mamas, we have failed our babies, exactly in the ways you talk about. While countries around the world have had more and more mothers surviving childbirth, here in the United States, we're one of only a handful of countries where it's actually gone down. And there is a specific problem, as you rightly identify, for women of color, who are 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. And here's the thing. Even after we do the adjustments for income, for education, this is true across the board. This is true for well-educated African-American women, for wealthy African-American women. And the best studies that I've seen put it down to just one thing: prejudice. That doctors and nurses don't hear African-American women's medical issues the same way that they hear the same things from white women. And we got to change that, and we got to change it fast, because people's lives are at stake. So I got a plan. Okay. And here's the plan. I know there are a lot of people, and probably a lot of people in this audience, who've been working on this issue. There are a lot of good ideas about how we could raise awareness of it and other kinds of things we could do to study it. But I got another approach that I want to use. I want to talk to the hospitals, is where most of these births take place, and I want to talk to them in the language they understand: money. Because here's the deal. Yeah, because here's the deal. Right now, the way that most medical procedures are treated, including those of childbirth, is that hospitals and the doctors who work for them and the nurses who work for them, that hospitals get fee-for-services. So they get something for the delivery room and something for the recovery room and something for all the different parts, right? And they get it no matter what the outcomes are. So we have an innovation that's been going on now in medicine for a while called bundled payments. And the way it works is, say you go to have your knee replaced. The hospital just gets a lump of money, and then the measurement is, did the person get a knee that they can walk on that's pain-free? Well, here's what I'd like to change right now in maternal health. And that is to say, the hospitals are just going to get a lump of money. And if they bring down those maternal mortality rates, then they get a bonus. And if they don't, then they're going to have money taken away from them. See the hospitals see it as their responsibility to address this problem head on and to make it a first priority. And the best way to do that is to use money to make it happen, because we got to have change, and we got to have change now. So that's my plan.
Thank you.
Do you have a second question?
Yeah.
We do? All right, let's bring in our next questioner. Come on out.
Hello, Senator Warren. I'm Chrissy Castro.
Hi, Chrissy.
Hello. I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation. I'm
Yes.
Nakai Dene, born for the one who walks around flag. With this administration, we've seen an affront to tribal sovereignty related to land and resource exploitation, attacks on our treaty rights, and violence against women with jurisdictional issues that have given rise to an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. If elected as president, what are your plans to uphold and strengthen tribal sovereignty of this land's First Peoples? And how are you going to make it a priority on your campaign?
Oh, thank you. It's a great question. So if we can, let's start particularly with the violence issue. You know, I'm so glad you're here to ask this question because it's an issue that we need to raise more awareness around missing and murdered Indigenous women. One of the reasons I strongly supported the 2013 Violence Against Women Act was that it expanded the jurisdiction of our tribal governments to be able to deal with violence against women, including violence committed by non-natives. And this was an important expansion. Let me just say it is critically important now that we reauthorize, again here in 2019, the Violence Against Women Act, and that we expand protection for Native women. But the issue you raise in the larger context about tribal sovereignty is one of the most significant. It is the reminder that we have a government-to-government relationship with tribes across this nation. And we have made, in the United States, our federal government has made promises and treaty obligations that it has failed to honor. The first thing we need to do is go back through our obligations and figure out how we can best honor those obligations. The second is when we propose legislation is to look at it through the lens of tribal government, to see whether or not we're actually respecting the tribal nations that are doing the work. And let me give you an example of that. So I have a bill with Elijah Cummings. Some of you may know Congressman Cummings from Baltimore, a good man. That's right, who has, the bill we have is called the CARE Act. And the CARE Act is modeled on the Ryan White CARE Act. Some of you may remember a time back in the 80s when HIV/AIDS, year by year, the numbers were going up, and the federal government would just nibble around the edges, put a little more money and a little more money, and the crisis just kept accelerating. And finally, a little boy named Ryan White declared that he had AIDS, and Congress said, enough is enough. We're going to put the resources that are needed in to be able to knock this problem back. And today, because that was done, there are people all across this country who either didn't contract HIV/AIDS or who are living with it successfully because government stepped in on the side of the people. Congressman Cummings and I want to do the same thing on the opioid crisis. It is time now. We will lose nearly 200 people today from the opioid crisis. It's like a plane crash, and it will happen again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And if someone who loves you came to you and said, I want help, they would have a less than 1 in 6 chance of getting the help they need. Not because we don't know what to do to help them, but because we don't put the money in, the resources in. We treat it not as a medical problem, but treat it with stigma. Congressman Cummings and I believe it is time to change that. And part of that is to make sure that money goes to the communities that are facing the opioid crisis head on, and particularly carved out in this, that money goes directly to the tribes that are dealing with this problem on the ground. It is a point of respect, it is a point of tribal sovereignty, and it should be a part of every piece of legislation that we consider. Thank you.
Related to the comments about the opioid crisis, many of us many of our communities suffered for the long-term effects of the war on drugs and criminalizing crack. So when someone in the audience said, "What about crack?" It's a real thing. There are people who who were criminalized and jailed and other things, and the community is still suffering. So what would you do as president to redress the harms done by the federal government in the war on drugs against our communities?
And the answer is we need both halves. Look, we have a real problem in the criminal justice system, and it is a race problem. We need to address that head on. We cannot pretend that we have a race-neutral criminal justice system. We don't. Study after study shows that for exactly the same crimes, African Americans are more likely than whites to be arrested, to be arraigned, to be taken to trial, to be wrongfully convicted, and to be given harsher sentences. That is a badly broken system, and we need reform of that system from the very beginning to the very end of it.
Senator, you went to the Mississippi Delta. You took your campaign to a non-traditional space, not a swing state, Mississippi.
I did.
What did you learn in the Mississippi Delta talking with those voters?
Well, I went to the Mississippi Delta for two reasons. The first one was to be able to talk about a housing plan that I've put out. You know, we've got a housing problem all across this country. We live in America now where there's plenty of housing available if you want to buy a McMansion. There's just not housing available for middle-class families, for working families, for the working poor, for the poor, and for the homeless. And the only way we're going to change that is not housing vouchers. The way we're going to change it is we're going to put real money in from the federal government to build new housing units. I have a proposal to build over 3 million new housing units here in America, in urban areas, in rural areas, and I wanted to be down in Mississippi to talk about this. But I want to tell you a part of that proposal because it tells you something about how I think we have to think about this problem. My proposal will reduce rents, Moody's says, by about 10% across the board by getting more housing and better housing available to people. But the question of home ownership is also tied up in this. You know, across this country, for a long time now, home ownership has been the number one way that families build wealth, working families do. Number one retirement plan in America, pay off your house and live on your Social Security. It's the one asset people buy that appreciates over time and intergenerationally. So if grandma and grandpa can live in the house until they pass, the next generation gets a boost, and the generation after that, and the generation after that. That's why it should be no surprise to anybody in this room that for decades and decades and decades, the federal government subsidized the purchase of housing for white people. For black people, they discriminated against them. And the method of doing this was known as redlining. So they drew off areas where they said plenty of subsidized mortgage assistance, except in the areas inside redlining. The consequence of that, generation after generation after generation, that's been one of the huge drivers of the black-white wealth gap. Well, we can't be in an America that says, well, you know what? We decided not to do that anymore, so everything's okay now. It's not okay. So look at it this way. Back in 1960, when housing discrimination was still legal, think about that, the black-white homeownership gap, right, between the two was 18 points, right, between blacks and white families. Then along comes the civil rights movement, and by golly, we outlaw housing discrimination, redlining goes away, and I will say this, two very interesting things happen. The black-white wealth gap and the black-white homeownership gap starts to shrink, and everybody starts to buy more homes. So it goes up for everybody does better when everybody does better, right? It's moving up, but the wealth gap is shrinking. This is a good thing. It tells us law matters. And then what happens? Long about the year 2000, right in there, the big banks look over the edge and they say, whoa, look at that community. African American communities, Latino communities. There's some wealth in there. Let's go sell them the most horrible, cheating, lying mortgages possible. That's what they did. And let's see how much wealth we can drag out of those communities. Now, they started figuring out how to make that work. It was the so-called subprime mortgage crisis. And understand, it didn't start with people trying to buy homes. It started with mortgage companies that went to people who already owned homes and helped take those homes away from them. They then targeted seniors who had built up a lot of equity. And over time, they spread it across the country. This is when, by now, we're in the early 2000s. I'm ringing the bell saying, this is coming. We're going to have a crash. People can't, the debt is unsustainable. Millions of people in this country are going to lose their homes. Millions are going to lose their jobs. Millions are going to lose their savings. But nobody in Washington wanted to hear this. I learned a fact. When your ears are stuffed with money, you can't hear well.
Can
I just do the last part of this?
Of course.
So all I want to say about the last part of this is the one-two punch from the housing crash means that today in America, black and white homeownership rates are larger than they were back when housing discrimination was legal. So I got a plan. I do. 3 million new housing units, but here's a core part of that plan. It says everybody who lives or lived in a formerly redlined district can get some housing assistance now to be able to buy a home. It's not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction.
I'm going to ask you a slightly different twist on the question we've been asking everyone, because I think that you've answered a lot of that question in your responses. We are at She the People, this wonderful organization that is empowering women and women of color. But when I talk with women of color in my own life, they'll say, wow, that Elizabeth Warren has great plans. She's got specific plans. She's got great ideas. But there's a fear in a lot of people of color and a lot of women of color that say, after the experience of 2016, they don't have the confidence in the electorate of this country to elect a woman president. They want to vote one way, but their fear says that they may need to flee to the safety of a white male candidate. How do you address?
I think that's called side-eye.
I'm just telling you, how do you address people who are not confident? They're not confident the country is willing to elect a woman. How do you address people who may be interested in voting for you, but may be afraid?
So, let me just say this about confidence. You bet. Look, this is the heart of it. It's how are we going to fight? Not just individually, but how are we going to fight together? Are we going to fight because we're afraid? Are we going to show up for people that we didn't actually believe in, but because we were too afraid to do anything else? That's not who we are. That's not how we're going to do this. Here's how I see this. I'll tell you how I see it. We got a room full of people here who weren't given anything. We room full of people here who had to fight for what they believe in. We have a room full of people here who had to reach down deep, and no matter how hard it was, no matter how scary it looked, they found what they needed to find, and they brought it up, and they took care of the people they loved. They fought the fights they believe in. That's how they got into these seats today. You know, this is how I see it from where I sit. I was in middle school when it's just my mama and my daddy and me. The boys are gone. My 3 older brothers, they've all gone off to the military. My daddy has a heart attack. Everybody thinks he's going to die. He comes back home. He can't work. My mother has never worked outside the home. We lose our family station wagon. My mother is terrified. I hear her at night. I hear her cry. I learn words like mortgage and foreclosure from my parents late at night while I'm supposed to be asleep. And I do remember the day I walk into their bedroom. I'm just a kid, and I see the dress laid out on the bed. You all know the dress. The one that only comes out for weddings, funerals, and graduations. And my mother's standing there in her slip and her stocking feet, and she's crying, and she's pacing, and she's saying, "We will not lose this house. We will not lose this house. We will not lose this house." She was 50 years old, and she had never worked outside the home, and she was terrified. I watched her face while she looked at that dress, and she looked at me, and she looked back at that dress, and finally she reached over and she pulled that dress on. She blew her nose, she put on her high heels, she walked to the Sears, and she got a minimum wage job answering the phones. The minimum wage job saved our home, and it saved our family. Now, let me just say about this. That day, my mama taught me 3 lessons. It took me a while to learn them. But the first one was, it doesn't make any difference how scary it looks, how hard it is out there. You reach down, you find what you have to find, you pull it up, and you take care of the people you love. I learned over time that wasn't just what my mama taught me. It's what millions of people across this country have taught their daughters and their sons through the years. You do what has to be done to take care of the people you love. But the third thing I learned eventually about that story is it's a story about government and how no matter how hard you work, the rules that are made by the people in government will still make the big difference in your life. Because when I was a girl, a full-time minimum wage job in America would support a family of 3. It would pay a mortgage, it would cover the utilities, and it would cover food. Today, a minimum wage job in America will not keep a mama and a baby out of poverty. That is wrong. It is worth fighting for, and it's why we're all going to stay in this.
Senator Elizabeth Warren!
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.